ago I made a video about an episode of Bojack Horseman, and since I'm rewatching the show with my boyfriend, I thought I'll make another one, because I have many Bojack thoughts. My last video did mention Penny tangentially, but this one is like a little bit more focused on Penny because it's about the Escape from LA episode where she shows up. I guess I just have a lot of Penny thoughts. I actually ended up watching with my boyfriend the season 1 episode Telescope and then Escape from LA from season 2 back to back, which I think is kind of a fun way to watch them because Telescope is where Charlotte shows up for the first time, and then Escape from LA is where Bojack goes to see her family. And I definitely noticed some things watching them so close together that I didn't notice the first time that I saw those episodes. There are actually some writing things that I don't quite like in both of them, so I'll also bring up the writing when it's relevant to what I'm discussing. One thing that does bother me about the dialogue between Bojack and Charlotte is that I feel like she kind of summarizes his whole personality kind of out of nowhere. I do like the conversation in general. I think when you're a trio of friends and one of you is moving apart and like it's also breaking up the dating relationship between Herb and Charlotte, how Charlotte's kind of like, like, what if it hadn't happened quite this way? What if Bojack and I had dated? I think that's genuine, but then she says that Bojack never would have asked her out because he's a coward, and I just feel like it's a little bit too on the nose, and I kind of don't believe that that would come up organically in the conversation. Is she so upset that Bojack didn't ask her out that she just decides he's a coward in general? I don't know. I don't know exactly what Charlotte is thinking. I feel like I'm not quite aligned with whatever her interiority is. I also kind of get that feeling in the episode Escape from LA because I think to support the plot of the episode and make the events more shocking for the viewer and for Bojack, there's a lot of stuff that must be going on inside the heads of both Charlotte and Penny that we are not really aligned with. There's nothing either in what they say or what they do that gives us a clue to exactly what they're going through emotionally in this episode. Interestingly, Bojack and Charlotte also share a line. Bojack says, "I think you've got the wrong idea," when Herb kisses him, which is also what Charlotte says when Bojack kisses her. So were Herb and Charlotte both into Bojack at one time? Questions. However, I think the kiss is portrayed as being more surprising in the scene with Bojack and Herb than what we see later with Bojack and Charlotte. Whereas in the scene with Charlotte and Bojack, they're out on the deck, they've been drinking, and they're actually cuddled up together. And I say this as a woman who dates men, but I'm going to get a little bit judgmental and say that the way that Charlotte is curled up with Bojack is a way that I don't even sit with my own brothers. I would not be that close to my brother if we were sitting together on the couch. I don't even get that close to other women, except in very, very few situations where I had a platonic friend who just was okay with that level of cuddling. So I read Charlotte's line, "I think you've got the wrong idea," not as someone who's completely surprised by what happened, but more as someone who knew it was a possibility, but really hoped it wouldn't happen. And it's just like, oh, we did end up here. So when Bojack asks Charlotte to say that she doesn't have feelings for him at all, and Charlotte doesn't answer that question directly. I take it as Charlotte does have some residual feelings for Bojack and maybe even did want to date him 30 years ago. She just is not going to tank her family and all those relationships for Bojack, which is obviously the right call in this situation. She does not feel the need to explain herself to Bojack at all. She just tells him how it is. She has no interest in anything romantic happening, and now that that line has been crossed, she wants him to leave peaceably and amicably while that's still an option. And he does not. He has to get himself into more trouble. So moving on to Penny, I think that she's a fun character because in this episode she's portrayed as both mature and also very realistically immature, which is very true of a teenager. They can kind of flip-flop between those two sides very quickly. And I think that the ways we see her immaturity are actually, to me, more compelling in showing why she should not be sleeping with a much older man than just the fact that she is a 17-year-old. Because we see that she cannot even have a conversation with the high school boy she has a crush on, let alone ask him out on a date. She's too overwhelmed and awkward to even get to that point. So I appreciate the showrunners for including that, although sadly I think maybe most viewers didn't focus on it enough. What bothers me in the episode is that her strong desire for sexual experience really doesn't appear at all until the end, at least through my read. I don't see her as someone who, throughout all we've seen of her, had a strong interest in a sexual encounter with someone else who treated her like a mature individual. Like, I'm not saying that's not the case. I think we're supposed to assume that, but it's just not really there until she propositions Bojack. I also find it hard to believe that someone Penny's age would see Bojack as a prospect. Nothing against Bojack or Will Arnett, the voice actor, but I'm sorry, like, you were old. Bojack is in his 50s, and my memory of being a teenager is that I might have had no sense of how, like, say, a guy in his late 20s is much older than me, and that would be inappropriate. But I certainly would not have had any interest in a guy 40-something years older than me. I'm not going to say either that there aren't teenagers who hit on much older adults, who even aggressively pursue older adults, but they're not usually like Penny. They're not usually very stable teenagers who come from supportive families. Another YouTuber I watch is Kat Black, and she does share a lot about having been one of those teenagers 15 or so years ago, and how it was very much part of having a traumatic family life, of not being accepted by her family, that she was so desperate for approval from these older adults. I think that does kind of get overlooked in a lot of discussion of informed consent and like having the relationship or the encounter mean the same thing to both participants. That little teenagers who are really aggressively going after much older people, yeah, probably something has happened to them. Like, something is not right in that situation, and it's because they're already very much not okay that this is something they want to do, which is not that sexy. And if it sounds extremely sad and unsexy, then your head is probably in the right place. Overall, the way that Penny talks about pursuing a sexual encounter, it sounds like, again, with Charlotte calling Bojack a coward and sort of reading his whole personality to him. It sounds like something the writers are putting in expressly to press all of Bojack's buttons, expressly to hit on all of his insecurities and sort of nudge him towards doing something he knows is pretty shady. When I was 17 and I was not a normal teen, I was a very sheltered teen, I had nothing against teenagers having sex. I only had problems with extramarital sex. So the idea that there was an age of consent would have been news to me. Like, I didn't even really have that on my radar or think about what it was. I was just like, well, I don't know, like, Romeo and Juliet is fine because they got married, even though she's like 13 and he's 17, but you know, God just says you have to be married, so that's cool. Which shows how stupid teenagers can be. Penny bringing up that she wasn't drinking that evening, that's a little bit more, maybe she heard that at some like sex ed at her school, like a PSA of, you know, if you want to have sex, it's better to not be drinking at the same time, just so you're aware of yourself and of the other person and you can check in with them. That I will give a pass, but I don't know, like a little cute little 17-year-old from a nice family hitting on a much older guy and just having the age of consent in her state and a knowledge of alcohol, like just pulling those out of her back pocket. That kind of seems like the fantasy of someone Bojack's age rather than how someone like Penny actually would act. So for me, I like the episode. I like Penny as a character, and I like Charlotte as a character. I think that maybe the writing just kind of falls into being too narrowly in Bojack's perspective and only seeing the other characters through his eyes and what they mean to him, and not quite giving them a consistent interiority so that we not being Bojack, can say like, oh, okay, that's what she's thinking in this situation. Even fun things can be a little bit better sometimes, and yeah, it's really fun to rewatch Bojack and force your significant others to watch it with you. That is the moral of today's video. Bye!